Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Owens seek recognition?
Strike the last word, please.
Gentleman is recognized.
Boy, I don't know really where to start on this one, to be honest with you. We're talking about crime. We're talking about pain of millions of people across our country. We're right now talking about drunk driving that's killing people, hurting our neighbors, our friends, and for some reason, my friend across the aisle decided to bring race into it. You know, this is the problem we've had, my race, for decades. With all due respect, it's called elitism. It's people who see other people in misery and don't get it. It's people who use misery as a political strategy. We have people across our country miserable. And we're here to talk about how to alleviate some of that. And out of that comes MAGA and race. My growing up, my definition of racism were those who looked at race first. Those who looked at outside in versus inside out. And the statements made earlier to me is, with all due respect, racist. And I don't care the color of those speaking it. We start looking at each other based on our color, and not based on getting solutions done. It's racism. And I tell you, American people are getting sick of this. We're sick and tired of divisiveness. We're sick and tired of every single city that's run by my party, my friends across the aisle, is a place where misery is highest, crime is highest, murder is highest, education is lowest, families are destroyed, and there's no sense of accountability. Instead of pointing a finger, let's look at some of these policies. This is a good example of one right now. We're trying to say 2 DUIs or 5 DUIs is too much to bring people like that back into the country to do more misery. That's what we're trying to say. It has nothing to do with race. It has to do with what they're doing, the action. And I think at some point there has to be some sense of no shame. You can't continue to say these kind of things and think it's okay. My friends, listen, I can't say enough. I would appreciate what we'll say a little earlier. You know, this is like Twilight Zone, some of the things we're going through right now. I mean, we're grown adults, we're responsible people. Come on, we need to be able to do some of this stuff where it's not total politics. This should be a no-brainer. And yet, here we are, saying that 5 DUIs is too much for the person who's culpable of this. We need to give them a break. Well, let me tell you this. American people across the country are tired of giving criminals a break. We want justice, we want fairness, and we want to live in a place where we don't feel fear every single time we walk out our door. And if you're not feeling that, that means there's a little bit of lack of empathy. Too many people are feeling that right now. I want to give my time to.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to pick up on, and I appreciate so much what he said, and the gentleman from Colorado earlier. But I want to pick up on something that the gentleman from Georgia said. He said, we need, and this is a direct quote, we need to bring compassion and mercy into our immigration system. Well, someone needs to tell President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas that, because their policies are creating so much misery for the people that the cartels are exploiting and bringing to our border and then moving into our country. We're all for compassion and mercy when it comes to what's happening, particularly to women and children on that journey. Everyone knows they don't get here but for the cartels who are exploiting them, making tons of money, not to mention what they're doing with the drug trade, bringing that into our country and our communities, and we all know people who've been impacted by that. So if we want to talk about compassion and mercy, someone better tell Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas, start thinking about that with your crazy policies, because they are harming people. And everyone knows that. And why you guys won't help us deal with that, I do not know. I yield back to the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, I yield.
I just had a chance to talk to Mr. Johnson of Louisiana, and I have a suggestion that might bring us together, and I think Mr. Johnson agrees, that we add on line 9, unless the convictions were, how did we say it, Mike? Are older than 25 years old.
And would you yield for a moment?
Yes.
So the idea would be to balance justice and mercy, which is, by the way, what Scripture calls us to do. And so that this is not recent convictions, but it covers your scenario where, you know, you've got a 79-year-old who had a problem many years ago, but he's redeemed himself. And if there's a reasonable limit, then that makes some sense. But the problem still is with the discretion that is provided to the Secretary that we don't trust.
I understand that, but we might be able to dispense with this if we, through unanimous consent, added unless the convictions are older than 25 years old, and then we accept the amendment.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think through the language and make sure that
And also on the line 14, both parts.
And so how many DUI convictions are we bargaining for here? Is it 5?
Well, we're taking your amendment and saying, but if the convictions are more than 25 years old,
Okay. What number of convictions? Any, 2?
well, it's the 5 that you've got in this amendment.
Okay.
And we are going to, I mean, this is the amendment before us, and you know, let's do this. Can we do this, Mr. Johnson?
Well, it needs to be 2, though, if we're going to exert this, right? I was going to bring the amendment for 30 and really test everybody tonight. I really was. It's prepared, so I mean.
Well, I guess the question is, we should have AA here to give us advice on what is,
No, we should have district attorneys here
well,
to give us.
but also in terms of recovery. And what I have been told, and I do not claim to be an expert, but for those people who I personally know who have beaten alcoholism, if you know, you get a gold coin at your 5-year period, and you think, you know, in most cases, you're not going to relapse if you've got your 5 years in, but if you had 5, you know, we want to be even more cautious than that. So I'm just trying to find some common ground here that would be sensible.
I mean, look, I like the spirit of it. It does, you know, put an end to the absurdity of the position that everyone is being backed into over there, and it, you know, maybe that's reasonable. So I would concede that. All my colleagues have to make their own decision on it, but that's acceptable to me.
Well, if we can rewrite this in rather than try and do it verbally,
Okay.
we'll temporarily withdraw. We'll have the staff
I'll agree
write
to do
this
that.
up, and the 2 staffs can talk, make sure that it reflects the discussion that we've just had, and
Very good.
all right,
I agree to withdraw.
temporarily.
Amendment is withdrawn temporarily. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman. Mr.
For
Chairman,
what purpose does Mr. Issa seek
I
recognition?
have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7946, offered by Mr. Issa. Page 20.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As an twice honorably discharged veteran, I hold a great deal of credence beyond for an honorable discharge. But as someone who served as an officer adjudicating men and women who broke that promise, who were punished under UCMJ, some of whom were discharged administratively and some of whom were discharged because of the court-martial process, I am all too aware that bad conduct discharges and even general discharges represent a less than honorable service during the modern times. For that reason, my amendment simply raises the bar for these individuals to those who have been honorably discharged. The term veteran, and I want to briefly, I'll ask unanimous consent to place into the record from the .mil website, Veterans and Military Funeral Honors and Benefits at Military One Source, the definition, and the entire into the record, if I could, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
But it starts off with, if you served at least 90 days of active duty since September 11th, 2001, you may be eligible for, and it goes on with a myriad of benefits. Mr. Chairman, if you entered the military and you served 90 days, 60 of which you were AWOL, you were discharged, probably other than honorable, but you were not given a dishonorable discharge, and therefore you are a veteran. It is that simple. 91 days before we kicked your butt out, even if you were AWOL, okay, all you had to do is come back to be discharged. The standard for the other than honorable, the bad conduct, those discharges do not deserve our consideration, and no veteran would stand up and say, yeah, the guy with a bad conduct discharge, he was just misunderstood. Mr. Chairman, it doesn't work that way. People who get those discharges earn them, and they deserve what they get. Now, we do still give them certain benefits. We do recognize that if they were injured, whether it was falling down or whatever in the line of duty, they can still go to the VA. So they do have benefits. And yes, even if they've been sent out of the country, we'll make sure they get their veterans benefits. But Mr. Chairman, this simple change to narrow the scope to those who have served honorably. And again, 90 days gets you honorable discharge technically. You come up as medically disqualified after 90 days, you still get an honorable discharge. I can go through a myriad of people who did not meet that challenge that Mr. Carrera or Mr. Johnson or others have said about these valiant people who served in harm's way. The fact is, we're going to still include people who simply showed up, served 90 or more days, and were discharged, as long as it's honorable. If it's less than honorable, Mr. Chairman, we should not be considering this broad bill under any circumstances. I would hope that the term veteran would mean honorably served veteran and not just anybody who managed not to get court-martialed at the highest and worst level, which is what the current bill says. And I've been stewing on this all day as a veteran, and I quite frankly insist on this amendment, and I see no reason that it would not be accepted by those in good faith who want to go through those who might be out there that meet that standard. It's not a high standard. It's the minimum standard that should be considered for somebody to be granted a reentry into the United States. And with that, I would yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on a point of order?
I do not insist on my point of order.
The gentlelady seeks recognition.
Yeah, I do seek recognition.
Lady's recognized.
I understand that my colleague from California, Mr. Isa, has very strong views on this, and he's given some examples that are of interest. On the other hand, I can't help but think back on Mr. Roy's comments earlier in the day, talking with a great deal of passion that someone who has declined to comply with the vaccine requirements of the military could end up with a general discharge. Someone else was quoting, it might have been you, Mr. Bishop, I can't recall, was reading the various types of activities that could lead to a general discharge. And one of them was committing adultery, in a custody, in a divorce proceeding. So I think there would be occasions where a general discharge would not be the kind of activity that you, Mr. Isa, have just described in defense of your amendment. And therefore, we ought to, let's say that we've got a legal permanent resident of the United States in the Navy. And the Navy was very concerned about, especially on ships, with COVID, and remember the transmissibility, and was very insistent on the vaccines to protect their readiness, is what they said, because they didn't want to have the fleet disabled because of disease transmission, the COVID transmission. You have a legal permanent resident who's in the Navy, who, for whatever reason, in good faith, I'm sure, doesn't want to do that. And so the option is, you do it, or you're not going to be on that ship with the hundreds of other sailors, and you're going to ultimately be discharged if you can't serve, but you're not going to be dishonorably discharged for that. That would be very unfair.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Yeah, your point is quite valid, but again, these are people who committed some other crime for which they were removed from the country. So all the examples you give would not have that legal permanent resident be removed. It would simply take away this special privilege of coming back.
Reclaiming my time, we do know that there are a number of individuals who have been removed, but not because of criminal activity. We've also discussed at great length the commission of offenses that are relatively minor in nature, where you might have a need to consider that because these are people who served our military. The only point I'm making, your amendment really would preclude consideration of anyone with who didn't get an honorable discharge, and there are people who, as I understand it, can get a general discharge who really haven't engaged in egregious behavior in the military. They just didn't go with the program in some way. For example, Mr. Roy's example of the military person who declined the vaccination. And it seems to me that that person with a general discharge should not be precluded from at least applying for discretionary relief, just like someone with an. Was it you? I'm sorry. I beg your pardon.
He's from North Carolina. No problem.
Okay. Seeking discretionary relief because they're a veteran. The whole issue is whether you've served your country, and I guess the point I'm making is that you could serve your country and we could admire your service and yet have done something that results in a general discharge instead of an honorable discharge, but we would still honor your service because of what you've done for our country. It doesn't necessarily reflect the full panoply of the service that you have given to the United States, and that's why I think we'd be better off not adopting this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I seek to speak on the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
There are just a few things I want to correct in the story or examples that were just given. I think it's been dispelled that the vaccine prevents the spread of COVID. I mean, I don't know why we're still saying that. I mean, the CDC director has apologized for being wrong about that. The NIH director said that he was wrong about that. Literally everybody, Deborah Birx.
Gentleman, yield.
I will yield.
Did Dr. Fauci admit that he was wrong about that as well yet?
I believe they've all admitted that.
No way.
So
They got the vaccine and they got COVID.
yes,
That ought to
they've
be
all
enough.
gotten COVID. The president himself is contagious right now, even though he's had 4 shots of the vaccine, and that is why he's staying away from people. So I just take a little bit of issue that we are in a congressional markup, still perpetuating this falsehood that was propagated by the pharmaceutical companies that stood to profit by this. They knew it wasn't even true. Their tests with 50,000 people in the trials were designed not to explicitly not show whether it did or didn't stop the spread of COVID. So I'm just offended that we're still perpetuating that myth when virtually everybody has admitted that it was a myth. And the reason we need to acknowledge that is the myth that underlies the entire rationalization for kicking somebody out of the military for not taking the vaccine.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield to the gentleman from California.
I can't wait for January 3rd, maybe the 4th, when one of our early H.Rs restores those men and women, those brave men and women who asked for and were denied their valid exemptions, and we restore them to full active duty, which, by the way, will unring the bell of any question of a general or other than honorable discharge, and I look forward to working with the gentleman on that.
I look forward to that, too. They should all be reinstated. None of them should have been given anything less than an honorable discharge at all for this. And while I've still got time on the clock, I have to mention that the Secretary of Defense issued a statement on August 24th saying that the vaccines that were required and that would be administered would be the FDA-approved vaccines, and not a single dose of FDA-approved vaccine, aka Comirnaty in the case of Pfizer, or Spikevax in the case of Moderna. Not a single dose of that has been given to a single member of the military, as the Secretary of Defense specified, and it was his only legal way to require the vaccine for members of military, was that it was FDA approved and that the doses that they would receive would be the FDA approved, legally distinct from the other vaccines that they received, and also labeled as such, labeled appropriately. None of those vaccines have been given, yet tens of thousands of members of the military have been kicked out for not taking that vaccine.
Gentleman yield?
I would yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
Is the gentleman suggesting that the military engaged in a bait and switch and substituted a different vaccine than that which was approved?
I am absolutely saying that what the Secretary of Defense is doing right now is illegal. We know it. I would characterize it as a crime in progress.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm going to yield to Mr. Tiffany, who's asked for
Yeah, I want to
time.
make sure I'm clear on this. Are you saying they've received the experimental use vaccine?
The emergency use authorization vaccine is all they've received. Not a single member of the military has received the FDA-approved version.
Well, it's good you're dispelling this notion that's out there that they're getting the FDA-approved vaccine.
There are two notions I want to dispel, and I would give the gentlelady time to respond to this. The notion that the vaccine stops the spread of COVID. Would the gentlelady like to clarify her comments on that?
Does the gentleman yield?
I do.
The point I'm making is that there's activity that service members could engage in that we would not find to be egregious. For example, the other
Adultery. You gave
adultery.
that
I mean,
example.
I'm not in favor of it. I think it's a
Right.
sin, but I don't think it's
Reclaiming my time. And I think the gentlelady gave valid examples, but the one that with all due respect, I don't think it's valid, is to substantiate the disproven notion that the vaccine stops the spread of COVID, and that would be a reasonable reason to give somebody a discharge that's less than honorable. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
speak in favor of the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support the ISA amendment because it does raise the bar, and I'm in favor of raising the bar by any means necessary because I think the underlying bill is ill thought. And I want to say again and emphasize that the primary reason we have a problem here is because of the man in charge of DHS. This bill gives him unilateral authority, and it is given to a figure that we do not trust. And I've been waiting for an opportunity to summarize this and tell you why, because some of you over there don't seem to understand. You act as though you're surprised by that. I've been making a few notes here while everybody's been talking. Let me just go through some of this. First of all of us have been to the border here, and we're outraged by what we've seen. We're outraged by it. Okay, but because of Secretary Mayorkas's deliberate and defiant policies, here's a list. We have a literal flood of lawless masses flowing across our border from more than 160 countries, and if you just turn on some news stations and you'll see accurate reporting of this. The safety and security of the American people are being directly threatened, and innocent children are being abducted, assaulted, raped, and murdered by human traffickers. You talk about problems that we should be addressing? That's within our jurisdiction. Because of Mayorkas, countless numbers of known terrorists and vicious gang members are coming across our border and making their way into our communities all over our country. The precious treasure of American taxpayers is being used to incentivize and reward illegals with food, clothing, health care, welfare benefits, and they even pay for ghost flights and bus tickets to secretly transfer waves of illegals into our communities all across this country. Hey, because of Secretary Mayorkas's policies, our entire country is becoming a crime scene. We're dealing with a humanitarian disaster that would have been unimaginable just 3 or 4 years ago. Because of Secretary Mayorkas' policies and decisions, the drug cartels are making billions of dollars and building their empires and drowning our streets in fentanyl and other deadly substances. We have made drug overdoses the #1 cause of death for Americans age 18 to 45. Our brave Border Patrol, law enforcement agencies, and officers are completely overwhelmed and personally endangered. The rule of law is being trampled underfoot every single hour that we sit here and dither over this stuff, and the stability and the very sovereignty of our nation is being threatened like never before. Secretary Mayorkas is doing more than insulting the intelligence of the American people. He is subjecting them to extraordinary danger, and this is not a game, because he's presided over the greatest immigration catastrophe in American history. It is an objective truth that he helped design and implement a system that has allowed record levels of illegal immigration, record levels of sex trafficking, all these narcotics, humanitarian disasters, and all the rest. He took his oath of office on February 2nd, 2021. By the end of that first year, listen, ICE recorded the highest number of border crossings and the lowest number of deportations in history. He stated publicly in direct defiance of our laws, and that's the key, quote, being here illegally by itself is not enough to be removed, unquote. And, quote, having an order of removal is not enough to actually remove someone. What? That's federal immigration law. If DHS does not deport illegals, apprehend, quickly remove people who cross into our country illegally, then we don't have border security at all. We have a total collapse of operational control. Mayorkas makes those decisions. If people are allowed to simply walk in here and live and work and collect taxpayer-funded benefits and assistance for years upon years and even permanently, then in a very short period of time, we're going to be totally overwhelmed and crushed by the sheer numbers and weight of illegal immigration. The American people understand this, and the Democrats in charge do not. And that's why we're outraged over this nonsense. There's no longer going to be any border, any security, any sovereignty at all. We're not even going to have our own country if this continues. I called for Secretary Mayorkas' resignation in July last year and explained that it had become crystal clear that he was either unable or unwilling to do his job. Based on the evidence we have now, we've reached the inescapable conclusion that his actions are intentional. His actions show that he is not competent as an agency head, and he is certainly not competent for this committee to give him any more authority over anything. Certainly not a unilateral, unchecked decision. It's dangerous, it's subversive, it's intentional, it's deliberate, it's premeditated. What else you gotta know? The evidence is out there. Border Patrol agents turned their backs on Secretary Mayorkas in Arizona last year because they don't trust or respect his leadership. And you know what? We don't either. He lied to Congress. He told us as recently as last week that the border security knows it's not true, and you guys know it's not true. So don't give him any more authority and don't ask us to participate in it. I'm not a part of that. It's a dereliction of his duty, and it's a dereliction of ours if we continue.
Could the gentleman yield?
I yield.
I might, in his remaining time, remind everyone, the gentlelady did say that, there were these situations in which, quote, you could get other than a honorable, which would include general. But that's not what the bill says.
Right.
The bill includes a bad conduct discharge. It only has dishonorable, the worst of the worst. You need years at Leavenworth to get a dishonorable in most cases. So let's understand it. This bill was carefully written. I assume that the people who wrote it are smart and well-informed, and it is flawed and should be changed, and this is a minimum change. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes? The gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Gosh, I thought I had heard everything, but we keep hearing about illegals. When we're talking about our men and women, many of whom are our Latino brothers and sisters who have served in our military, came here, served us, while many of us did not serve. They served, and they came back with post-traumatic stress and all other kinds of ailments. And we don't have the decency to have a heart for them when they need a second chance, when their families are suffering. We callously keep talking about drug dealers and rapists and criminals, just like we heard when down the dissension of the Golden Stairway back in 2015, it's become okay to keep talking about drug dealers and rapists and saying that people are invading our country. Our borders are under assault. We're losing our country. If we don't stand up and take our country back now, from these people, from these hordes of illegals coming across our border, frightening people. This is not the way that we talk about people who have served our country, but this is what we hear from the MAGA Republicans. It's getting rather sickening. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Nobody seeks
I
recognition.
would.
Nobody seeks recognition. The question occurs on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no?
No.
In the opinion, in the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee.
Put your
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch.
I wish I could tell you.
Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
Oh, wait, Deutsch votes no.
Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu.
Okay, so Escobar and McClintock, of course.
Mr. Raskin.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal.
That amendment in that they've agreed on.
Ms. Stimmings. Ms. Stimmings.
Demings votes no.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon.
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia. Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean votes no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa.
I will be yes on my amendment.
Mr. Issa votes yes. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stube. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy.
Aye.
Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Deutsch, you are not recorded.
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
How's Jayapal recorded?
Ms. Jayapal, you are not recorded.
Jayapal votes no.
Ms. Jayapal votes no.
How is
Are there any-
Jackson Lee recorded?
Ms. Jackson Lee, you recorded as no.
Thank you.
Are there any members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 16 ayes and 20 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments? For what purpose does Ms. Luffen seek?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Amendment is considered as read. The gentlelady's given 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
I won't take 5 minutes. We had an animated discussion earlier about the gentleman from Louisiana's amendment precluding consideration for 5 convictions. And as we discussed publicly, I suggested that we add the words unless the conviction is older than 25 years. So this amendment reflects that discussion, that the someone with 5 offenses would not be eligible for review unless the conviction was older than 25 years. And I don't feel a need to discuss it further since we had a long discussion earlier, so I would yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Aye.
The ayes obviously have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? The question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. As amended. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Are there any amendment?
Wait.
Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 7946 is amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chair, the bill. The recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch.
Aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass. Ms. Bass.
Aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Just like I will.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Jayapal votes aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demmings.
Aye.
Ms. Demmings votes aye. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
McBath votes aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Dean votes aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones.
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy.
Roy, get with the program.
Mr. Roy.
No.
Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach? Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no.
This is Mr. Cohen. How am I recorded?
Mr. Cohen, you are not recorded.
Record me as aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye.
Thank you.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 23 ayes and 16 noes.
The bill is agreed to. The ayes have it, and the bill is amended. It's ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2920, the American Families United Act, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 2920 to amend the Immigration and Nationality
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 2920, the American Families United Act of 2022, is bipartisan legislation to fix barriers in our legal immigration system that separate U.S. citizens from their spouses and children. Earlier this Congress, the Immigration Subcommittee held a hearing that shined a light on how our immigration laws are particularly harsh for U.S. citizens with undocumented spouses and children. For example, under current law, many U.S. citizens cannot sponsor their spouses and children for a green card. In large part, this is because there are very limited discretionary waivers of inadmissibility or deportability and significant bars for unlawful presence. As a result, many family members are virtually shut out of the system with no means of obtaining lawful status. Today, 1.7 million U.S. citizens are married to an undocumented person. Roughly a quarter of them have been married for 20 years or longer, while more than half have been married for 10 years or longer. Among the many people facing hardship because these restrictive immigration laws are my constituent, Dr. Kevin Kells, who has lived apart from his wife for over 15 years. In 1998, before they met, Dr. Kells' wife traveled to the United States to attend a high school graduation party. She didn't speak English, but the driver of her car told the border officer that she was born in the United States. Her record now shows that she made a false claim to U.S. citizenship, and she is permanently barred from the United States. Under current law, there is no ability for Dr. Kells to obtain a green card or lawful status for his wife, nor are there options for many others, given the limited discretion of immigration judges and officers to waive the consequences of past acts, even those that were based on honest mistakes made decades ago. H.R. 2920 is a bipartisan compromise introduced by Representatives Veronica Escobar and David Valadao. It provides a narrow solution that would give Dr. Kells and other separated American families an opportunity to sponsor their family members. This bill would simply provide immigration judges and officers the discretion that they need to waive certain grounds of inadmissibility or deportability on a case-by-case basis for the spouses and children of U.S. citizens. To be clear, this bill does not address all of the issues affecting family reunification. For example, it would not provide discretion for immigration judges and officers to help the undocumented parents of millions of U.S. citizen children. We have passed bills through the House, including the Build Back Better Act, to give relief to these worthy individuals. Sadly, that legislation is stalled in the Senate, but we will continue to fight for relief for all. In the meantime, we can also put forward solutions where there is common ground with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I'm pleased to support this bipartisan solution that would take a significant step toward reuniting countless mixed-status families. I would like to thank Ms. Escobar and Mr. Valadao for their leadership and for working together to support American families. And I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation is an attack on the rule of law. H.R. 2920 would give the AG and the Homeland Security Secretary the power to prevent removals and provide immigrant benefit to aliens in cases where the removal or denial of a benefit will be a, quote, hardship to a U.S. citizen, spouse, child, or parent of alien. This discretion is allowed even if the alien has received due process and has been ordered removed by an immigration judge. The bill before us would untether immigration policy from requirements laid out by Congress and hand this decision-making power to the AG and the Homeland Security Secretary so that they don't have to enforce the law. What a deal for taxpayers. There have been over 800,000 known, quote, gotaways since President Biden took office, thanks to his embrace of radical open borders policies. And of course, that's on top of the 3 million alien encounters at the border during this administration. During fiscal year 2021, there were 1,734,686 encounters, and we are already at 1,746,119 encounters in this fiscal year, with 3 months remaining. Fiscal year 2022 is on track to have the most encounters of illegal aliens at our southern border ever in history. Meanwhile, the Democrats on this committee refuse to even acknowledge that there is a problem. And rather than to do anything to address this crisis or enforce law and prevent more people from crossing illegally, Democrats want to relax the laws so that bureaucrats in Washington can more easily reward those who broke the laws. This is wrong, Mr. Chairman. We strongly oppose this legislation and yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included on the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
I
2920.
ask unanimous consent that the reading be dispensed with.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will now recognize myself to explain the amendment. The changes in this amendment are either technical in nature or are necessary to clarify the intent of the underlying legislation. Most of these changes reflect the advice of the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice, both of which provided technical assistance on the bill. To avoid any unintended negative inferences, the amendment makes changes to ensure that the waiver authority in this bill does not impact any existing authorities in the Immigration and Nationalities Act. This change was recommended by the Department of Homeland Security. Among other changes, the amendment includes language to clarify that the waiver authority in this bill is limited to the family members of U.S. citizens, and for purposes of relief under the legislation, family separation must result from removal or denial of a benefit. The amendment also clarifies that the family members of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents who committed crimes that would make them inadmissible or deportable would not be eligible for the waiver in this bill. In addition, the amendment removes a provision that is outside the intended purpose of the bill to reunite families in the United States related to naturalization for the children of U.S. citizens abroad. To close gaps in the bill that would leave some American families behind, the amendment also makes changes to ensure that widows and orphans of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents can still receive the benefits in this bill, and to allow those American families who are separated before this bill passed a chance to sponsor their family members for a green card. All of the changes made in the amendment are minor and improve on a good bill. I urge all of my colleagues to support it. And I want to make note for the members that I intend to recognize Ms. Escobar and Mr. McClintock for statements on the bill. Then we expect to move to a vote on final passage of the bill. At that point, we expect to conclude our business for the day. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to you and Ms. Lofgren, our Immigration Subcommittee Chair, for bringing my bill, the American Families United Act, before the committee for markup. Colleagues, I'd like to share the story of my constituent, Edgar Falcon, with you, who is the inspiration for this bill. Edgar is a great person, born and raised in my community of El Paso, Texas. In 2013, Edgar, an American citizen, married the love of his life, Maricruz, a Mexican citizen. In fact, right behind me is their wedding photo. They married atop the Paso del Norte International Bridge between El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. Edgar and Maricruz have a beautiful 3-year-old American daughter, Giselle. Edgar is a loving husband and devoted father. But Edgar and his family are denied the opportunity to live their lives to the fullest because of a 1996 law, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, or Ira. Maricruz is a Mexican citizen who, as a child, was persuaded by an older family member to falsely claim American citizenship at a U.S. port of entry. Because of Ira, and because of that one incident at the land port when she was a minor, taking the advice of a trusted adult, Maricruz is now forever barred from entering the country. As a result, Edgar has had to make a terrible choice: either leave his community and his country in order to raise his family and live with his wife and daughter, or self-separate from his wife, daughter, and everything he holds dear in order to remain and work in the United States. He and his family have suffered significantly because of Ira. It took away an immigration judge's discretionary authority to review and decide cases like Maricruz's. But it's not just Edgar and Maricruz who are suffering this way. Millions of Americans, including American children like Giselle, are being denied the ability to live in the United States together as a family. And because of Ira, they are denied the ability to go before a judge to lay out the facts of their case so that the judge may determine if they are eligible for a chance at legalizing their status or not. The American Families United Act is a long overdue piece of bipartisan legislation that would restore the opportunity for American families across the United States to have their day in court. Simply put, my bill will grant immigration judges and officers the ability to waive, on a case-by-case basis, certain grounds of inadmissibility or deportability if denial of immigration relief would result in hardship to a U.S. citizen, spouse, parent, or child. I remind my colleagues this discretion is not new or unprecedented. This judicial discretion was taken away from immigration judges with the passage of Ira in 1996, and this bill would restore it. Colleagues, the results of this provision in Ira have been devastating, heartbreaking, and unnecessarily destructive to American families, and there are innumerable examples of that heartbreak even in your own districts. Many of those families, your constituents, are actually watching this hearing right now, praying for an end to their nightmare. My colleagues, you frequently say, all of us frequently say, that we support legal immigration. This is an opportunity to put that support into action, to stand by that claim and to recognize the rights of Americans, to make sure that they have the opportunity to go before a judge and possibly have the chance to live together, a family united. This bill does not grant amnesty, nor does it reward undocumented immigrants for being present in the United States. My bill does not require that anyone be issued a green card. It simply allows spouses and children of U.S. citizens to have an opportunity to argue their case in order to finally get in line for a green card. The American Families United Act gives families a fighting chance to stay together and ensures that children can have both of their parents at home while righting a 28-year wrong that has kept families apart, living with unnecessary pain and separation. I urge you, my colleagues, to support this bill today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 18 months ago, we had achieved operational control of our southern border. The border wall was nearing completion. The Remain in Mexico policy and enforcement of court-ordered deportations had slowed illegal immigration to a trickle. American workers were finally seeing major wage gains, and the gap between rich and poor in this country was finally narrowing. All of that ended on January 20th, 2021, when Joe Biden canceled the Remain in Mexico policy, ordered ICE to stop enforcing court-ordered deportations, and canceled the border wall, leaving construction gaps through which thousands of illegal immigrants now pass every day. Since this administration took office, more than 3 million foreign nationals have illegally entered our country, with roughly half being trafficked across the country by this administration. While the Border Patrol's been overwhelmed, an additional 900,000 illegal entries evaded authorities that we know of and are now in the United States. In other words, in 18 months, the Democrats have allowed into our country an illegal population larger than the size of the states of Alaska, Vermont, and Wyoming combined. Fentanyl crossing the southern border has exploded. The death rate from fentanyl overdoses in this country has more than doubled in a single year. The effect on school and hospital overcrowding, homelessness, depressed wages and opportunities for working families, and crime will mean a much more dangerous and impoverished country as a direct result of these policies. Deaths at the border have skyrocketed as more and more illegal migrants are encouraged to make this dangerous journey. On every trip I've made to the southern border, border agents have told me to warn my constituents that the tragedies that they encounter every day in the border communities are being exported across the country and that every town will soon become a border town. And now I'm hearing the same thing from my own constituents in Northern California. This committee has blocked every Republican effort to address this national crisis. Every hearing the Democrats have had about this crisis is how to increase it. The bill now before this committee, H.R. 2920, gives the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security the discretion not to enforce U.S. immigration law regarding removal, inadmissibility, or provision of an immigrant benefit if enforcing such a law would be a, quote, hardship for the alien's U.S. citizen, spouse, parent, or child. Well, what isn't a hardship in this world of ours? Why not just repeal the law entirely? That would have the same effect as this bill. The Democrats have already applied existing grants of discretion that are explicitly limited to review on a case-by-case basis, as we've just been promised, but they've used it to excuse entire classes of people. Under this bill, separation of a family member is presumptively considered to constitute hardship and therefore grounds not to enforce our immigration law. Relatives already deported under our already loose laws would be admitted under this bill. So who needs immigration courts if their orders are to be invalidated? So why not just repeal our immigration law, require the admission of all family members regardless of previous deportation orders or determinations of inadmissibility? With very few exceptions, that's what this bill does anyway. Why not just admit it? The unprecedented illegal mass migration that is aided, abetted, encouraged, and applauded by congressional Democrats and their president has reached historic proportions, and its impact is now being keenly felt by every American. Democratic mayors of northern cities are even starting to sound the alarm, but congressional Democrats are deaf to their pleas. Americans are increasingly aware of the staggering cost of these policies to their safety, their prosperity, and their futures. But they need to understand that these policies will not change until the people responsible for them are turned out of office. The only question for our country is if there's still time. I yield back.
We're about to move to final passage on this bill, but all members will have an opportunity to submit statements for the record. The question occurs on the amendment nature of a substitute. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Opposed,
Aye.
no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment nature of a substitute is agreed to. Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 2920 is amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
Aye.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered reported favorably as a roll call requested. Recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch.
Hey, hang on one second, I have to vote.
Ms. Bass.
Bass votes aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Cicilline.
Yes, aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye for Swalwell.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal?
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Dimmings? Ms. Dimmings?
Aye.
Ms. Dimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon?
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia?
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath?
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton?
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean?
Dean votes aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar?
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones?
Aye.
Mr. Jones votes aye. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Jordan? No. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stube? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy?
No.
Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach? Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes no.
How am I recorded? This is Bass.
Ms. Bass, you recorded as no. Ms. Bass, you recorded as aye.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
How am I recorded?
Mr. Deutsch, you were not recorded.
Deutsch votes aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 23 ayes and 16 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is amended as ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all adopted amendments. The staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes. This concludes our business for today. Thanks to all of our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.